It's really a distinct pleasure to be back at Aspen. My wife Rana and I, we always enjoy it here. And I'd just like to say a special thanks to two people who are joining us here this morning, Joe and Sandy Rotman. Joe and Sandy are two of Rana and I's dearest friends from Toronto. He and Sandy endowed the business school in which I teach, the Rotman School of Management, and also endowed the institute that makes this work possible. We're doing big things in Toronto and hope to be doing more things like this there. Well, if you read your USA Today that was delivered to your hotel doorstop this morning, there was a story, I believe it was on page 2 or 3, which basically bore the theme, cities are back. And they traced the growth of the US population, according to census data, over the past decade from 2000 to 2010. And they compared that to the growth of our cities. I'll be talking about metro areas in a minute, but these are our center cities in the United States. And found that of 33 cities with more than 500,000 people, all but 30 of them outpaced the national average, and more than 3/4 of the 100 largest cities in the United States outpaced the national average. Now, this is becoming conventional wisdom that cities are important to our economic growth and development. But remember, it wasn't always that way. When I started out as a scholar in the late 1970s and 80s, people were talking about the crisis of the cities, the urban crisis, the fiscal crisis of New York and other cities, population, innovative people, companies were moving to the suburbs or to the Sun Belt. Indeed, we were talking about, if you read The Economist, the end of geography, the death of distance. When I wrote Rise of the Creative Class 10 years ago, I had to write sections, and in revising the book, as Walter so kindly pointed out, we added 5 new chapters to the book. I had to counter the notion that somehow new technology, the rise of the internet, the rise of globalization were making cities completely irrelevant. Well, the data speak for themselves. Just a few years ago, the world became urban. In that year, for the first time in human history, more than half of us across the world's surface live in cities in urban areas. You guys can move it along for me. This is the first time I've ever used graphics, so please pardon me. But what's particularly interesting, if you look at the broad sweep of economic history, in the year 1800, you can't see it there, less than 3% of the Earth's population lived in cities and urban areas. By the year 1900, that was 14%. 1950, it had grown to 30%, 50% now, and by 2050, fully 70% of us. So the majority of our 7 billion people on Earth will be urban. And we know that with an increasing level of urbanization comes all good things. Societies get richer, societies get more developed, they become more open-minded and tolerant and democratic. If you take, and this is statistics from the McKinsey Global Institute, who's doing very interesting work in this subject, by 2050, just the 600 cities they follow will grow by $30 trillion, accounting for 2/3 of global growth, and of course, the big action will not be in the advanced world, in the United States and Canada and Europe and Japan, where our cities will grow. Certain cities will grow, others will decline. But we will see massive city building in the so-called BRICS economy, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and particularly in India and China. Now, the reason I wanted to do this presentation to you all in a graphic format today was because our research group at the Martin Prosperity Institute, and now a number of other research groups, have begun to develop some detailed way, a comprehensive way of gauging the world's cities. Conventional measures, as many of you probably know, of economic output or innovation, gross domestic product, they don't cover cities in metro areas. We only have this data. Well, we have it for the advanced nations, for city and metro areas, for the US and Canada and Europe and Japan and a few others. But for most nations, we only have their national GDP. But some very crafty young scholars, computer scientists, software folks, people who are used to working with satellite images, figured out some time ago that you could use the NASA images of the world at night that project light emissions to derive, and this is what is so fascinating about this field, to derive the economic output not only of nations, but for cities and metro regions across. We have a term for this, it's a clunky term, sorry, we call it light-based regional product. We can estimate this for every square kilometer on the Earth's surface. Now, we're not the only group that's done this. Bill Nordhaus's group has done this. Vern Henderson, a very, very famous urban economist at Brown, and a group of people have just published a paper in the American Economic Review, and the Henderson paper is very interesting, because I'm kind of, at times, a little bit humble about these kind of metrics, and certainly putting them on the same level with a robust measure like gross domestic product. What Henderson, who's a very capable and senior economist, says, he believes that these satellite images may in fact be better estimates of economic activity than even GDP. What Henderson points out, so interestingly, is GDP is derived from surveys of companies, of workers, of firms. Those surveys tend to be fairly well done in a country like the United States or Canada or Germany. But in lots of places, they're terribly done. And they're not done terribly frequently. And they cover different timescales. And they measure sort of different things. And they do not cover, we can make no comparisons. Really, using the standard measures, it's even hard in our institute to compare the US and Canada. Never mind the US, Canada, and Europe. Never mind the US, Canada, and Europe and the rest of the world. We can produce precise boundaries of the entire world's cities. We can look at their growth over time as long as the satellite images are available for. And we can project that out into the future. And we can create systematic and comparable data. So this is what the world looks like. Originally, by the way, I'm a huge admirer of Tom Friedman's work. I am, and I think he captured an enormous, I'm not getting us caught in a drinking game, by the way. I think he captured an enormously important part of how the world was disaggregating and how key and core economic functions were being moved out of the advanced industrial nations. But there's a counterforce. With every force comes a counterforce. And the counterforce is that much of the world's economic activity, as it globalizes, also concentrates. This is something my dear friend John Hagel has written about with John Seely Brown and others. But here we can capture it. So the blue spikes are where the world's population is. You can see that population is reasonably concentrated, but it spreads itself across the world's great surface. As we look at things like economic output derived from the satellite data, we start to see fewer spikes. We start to see that economic output is concentrated in mainly several regions in the United States, flowing up to Canada across those two borders, and then in Western Europe, and again, in Asia. And what's very interesting is when we look at innovation, and more interesting data is now becoming available on this, innovation is particularly spiky. If you want to look at where the innovative action is in the world economy, it's in a relatively small number of places. Just as a punchline, the world's 100 largest metropolitan areas, this is in a world with billions of people, generate 4.5 trillion in economic output, 60% of the global total, while housing just 29% of its people. Now, the second thing this light data enables us to get a handle on is not only the rise of metro regions, which we all know, like a greater Denver or greater New York or greater Boston or greater Toronto. It enables us to identify with great precision the world's mega regions. And I can show you where they are. This is the map using light data of the mega regions of the United States and Canada. Look at the Great Boswash Corridor. 20 million people, 2 trillion in economic output. Charlotte, we have fun with the names, you know. We like to have fun with the names. SoFlo, New Orleans, Dallas, Austin, and of course the one I live in, Tor Buffchester, And the other one that borders the two countries, Cascadia, and one, SoCal, which tracks into Mexico. And the next two slides will just show you the same for Europe. And then I love Ambrustorp, Lund, Leadchester, so on and so forth. And then for Asia, what's particularly interesting about this is, although we distill the light boundaries fading a little bit between the great megalopolis of Japan, one could argue that Japan is already one large, densely interconnected megaregion. Megaregions are places where people now can move more fluidly between, that function as an integrated market. These are really the economic engines of our time. Kenichi Omai, a long time, talked about the rise of the region state and how the region state was going to eclipse the nation state. A great geographer named Jean Gottman talked about the rise of the megalopolis and how the megalopolis was the natural economic unit with the size and scale and market. There are 40 sizable megaregions in the world economy. These are how powerful, and I would say these are the key driving force for what matters. These 40 largest megaregions house a fifth of the world's population. They produce 2/3 of our total economic output, and they drive 85% of our innovative activity. Now, with this in mind, I want to shift gears a little. If you have a basic template or a basic visual understanding of how concentrated the world has become, how spiky the world has become, how much our world has become organized around cities, and what a change this was. You know, as a young boy, I was born in Newark, New Jersey. And to give you a picture of this, I was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1957. So I still remember Philip Roth's Newark. I still remember a Newark that was bustling with Italian, Jewish, Hispanic, Latino, Puerto Rican, African-American neighborhoods that had a bustling downtown center of commerce with Bamberger's and Kresge. It had a great newspaper, the Newark Star Ledger. It had great universities and colleges. I was born in the Italian-American North Ward of Newark. My parents suburbanized, I say that euphemistically, to a place called North Arlington, kind of a Jersey Shore kind of place, but not on the Jersey Shore. Very rough and tumble New Jersey working class suburb. And in 1967, as a young boy, I watched Newark go up in flames. Not only did I watch Newark go up in flames, but I watched the factory where my dad worked as an eyeglass worker making eyeglasses. I watched that factory that was once a bustling factory employing thousands of men begin to shrink and shrink and shrink until that factory was shuttered. No one would have believed in the 1970s or even the 80s that cities are the basic engine of human progress, but they are, and not just in our time. Cities, I will submit to you, have been the basic engine of economic progress all along. But we took a detour in the industrial age. With the Industrial Revolution, because our technologies were so robust, because our machines were so big, because our companies were so great and vertically integrated, because our ports were so large, our railroads so big, our highways and airports so well functioning, we began to believe that it was firms and industries and technologies that powered growth. But in fact, it's cities that provide the basic fundamental engine of economic progress. And the person who figured this out, many of you will be familiar with, is not a PhD economist or sociologist or geographer. It's a woman from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who never completed her PhD. Went to work at the Architectural Record or Architectural Forum in New York in the 1950s and began to observe her neighborhood on Hudson Street in Greenwich Village. She wrote several books. The best known is The Death and Life of Great American Cities. But there are two others. When asked, and I became dear friends with Jane when we moved to Toronto, when asked what her greatest achievement was in the late 1990s or early 2000s, she was a very humble woman. She said that, I think I figured something out that all other economists missed. She said, economists like Adam Smith or Alfred Marshall, very smart people, had always believed that the key to a more robust economy was efficiency and a deep and deepening division of labor. And Jane said in her commonplace language, she said, well, you study pin factories, you study car factories or steel factories, Yes, that's very understandable. As you become efficient, you can make more things. You can make stuff less expensively. She said, but that doesn't really answer what economic growth comes from. She said, where economic growth comes from is the ability to create new things, to generate new work. And she said, quite controversially, and people called her a heretic, she said, when you look back through the great expanse of human history, you will find that it wasn't hunter-gatherer societies that gave rise to agriculture, that gave rise to trade and mercantilism, and then little small-scale industry and then full-scale industrial capitalism. You will find that cities powered all of these advances, because what cities do is enable us, people, to combine and recombine, to share our ideas and talk to one. On the little bus ride over, we were discussing this with a colleague from UCLA, and the bus rider turned around and said, that makes perfect sense. Well, cities are where people meet and greet. People are where people share ideas. And Robert Lucas, when he won the Nobel Prize, said this, the University of Chicago economist. He said that Jane Jacobs discovered the basic mechanics of what power economic development. He called them human capital externalities, the kind of advances in productivity improvements and gains we get from being around one another. Now, more recent research from archaeologists and anthropologists is very intriguing, and I'm digging into this research myself. I believe it will be my next project. But The Economist magazine had a very interesting one-off when we crossed the 50% mark as an urban population. They said perhaps human beings have gone from being Homo sapiens to Homo urbanus. I like that term. But they didn't quite understand the depth of what Homo urbanity means. That cities are our greatest invention. They are humankind's greatest invention. They are our cradles of civilization. In fact, cities are what made us human in the first place. If you look at the research of the groups at UCLA and Imperial College, looking back through the anthropological and archaeological record, they are finding that what we used to think of as this great leap in human cognitive capability that differentiated us from animal life and other species came not from some magical widening of our minds or increase in brain size. It makes perfect sense when you think about it. It came from our densest civilizations at the time, where human beings were able to meet and talk to one another and interact and fuel one another. They are finding archaeological record shows the earliest advances in arts and tool making and in the shift to basic modern human civilization. Our dear friends at the Santa Fe Institute, led by Jeffrey West, Louis Betancourt, and Jose Lobo, that we work with all the time, have coined a term for this. Why cities now power economic development in our day. They call it urban metabolism and say that cities are a special kind of organism. Well, for most organisms, as we increase in size, and in my case, as I increase in age, our metabolism slows down. So as we go from a mouse to a dove to a chicken to a cat to a human being to an elephant, as an organism gets larger, its metabolism goes down. But cities are different. According to their research, which looks at rate of innovations, rate of productivity, rates of all sorts of advances, what happens in cities is that the urban rate of metabolism, and you can see this. You know, when you go to the airport and you're looking at people going to a older, developing economy destination, they're walking more slowly, they're talking more slowly. And then you put yourself in Denver or Aspen. Never mind, put yourself in New York or Tokyo. The way people talk, the way people walk, the whole organization is speed. Cities are combination and recombination and speed machines. So this is a graph published in Scientific American of their work. It simply shows that when you look at the distribution of US cities, it looks like the orange line. When you look at wages, the wages are growing faster, and an even bigger line holds for innovation, and an even bigger line holds for scientific advance. West and his colleagues at Santa Fe have a word for this. They call it superlinear scaling. In our time, cities have become even more important. In fact, in the knowledge-based economy, or what I call the creative economy, I dub it that because I want to differentiate between the knowledge we acquire or the information we create or the technologies we generate to something that is intrinsically human. What is intrinsically human, and that all of us share, is our innate human creativity. We see it in every boy and girl. We see it everywhere we go. We are creative beings, and cities are the cradles of our creativity. And what is happening today is if the industrial corporation was the social and economic organizing unit of the industrial age, in fact, the city, the metropolitan area, and the mega region is the social and economic organizing unit of our time. This is a simple graph which shows the great economic transformation we have been through. The working class rose dramatically through the course of the late 19th and 20th century. It stabilized for a time, and as industry declined, it declined, and we have seen the rise of a creative and service-driven economy, powered by the rise of new occupations, powered by the rise of innovation, powered by the rise of skill. But if you think of the three basic drivers of economic growth, they're technology, skill, and our ability to organize ourselves into cities. And what this slide simply shows is that if we look at the level of skill or human capital, or what I call people who work in the creative occupations, scientists, technologists, engineers, business managers, people who work in healthcare, education, arts, cultural, musicians, design, and other creative people, that the clusters are becoming ever more concentrated, and urban economists suggest that part of what undergirds inequality in our country, I tackle this, it's not the subject for today, but I tackle this in great depth in Rise of the Creative Class Revisited. What undergirds rising social and economic inequality in our country is this divergence in the kinds of work we do and in the kinds of skills we have. Now, lastly, if we understand that cities are becoming more important, that they house a greater share and number of our people, that they're the place where industry becomes more productive, people become more effective, innovation rises. If we understand that cities are the basic motor force of human progress, our data on the world's cities confront us with a very startling fact. It's not just that socioeconomic inequality is growing in the United States. And it's not just that socioeconomic inequality has a geographic casting. That socioeconomic inequality is reflected in our geography. As one of my colleagues said, increasingly we live in different cities. We occupy different worlds. We have different values. My own research shows, just by looking at the concentrations of education, skill, creative workers in metros, we can predict levels of obesity, levels of smoking, levels of gun violence, levels of fitness, levels of happiness, American voting patterns. But not only is this at work in the United States, it's at work across the world, and I think this is something we all need to be aware of. That even though we live in a time where cities are the great fulcrum of human progress, not all of us are fortunate enough to live in a place where cities work the same way. We're confronting a global divide not just between nations, but between and among cities. Thanks, guys. You know, when sometimes I look at the world and we think about globalization and we think about how common we've become or how flat things are, I think we're looking at each other from the peaks of the advanced cities. You know, in my dad's day or my granddad's day, somebody living in New York and London, never mind Tokyo or Hong Kong or Singapore or Shanghai, lived in different universes. Now, when we travel to those cities, when we meet our friends from those cities, when I teach our students from those cities, we're more or less the same. That there is a lifting that has gone on, not only with regard to economic output, but a change. In fact, I would submit to you that this skilled class is global. But when we take the satellite data, and we've just done this, and I have just a few cool maps to show you guys. For the first time ever, no one to my knowledge has ever done this. It's very much a first pass analysis. We have some more refinements to do, but what we did was take that satellite data I showed you. It allows us to estimate this light-based regional product or economic output for every square kilometer, for every city, for every metropolitan area on Earth, and we simply matched it to the World Bank's levels of development for the world economy. Now, this map shows you how divided the world is. If you look at the blue dots, they are the very high-income cities. The green dots, high-income cities. A high-income city, by the way, has a per capita economic output of about $12,275 and above. And you can see the levels, the lack of development in Africa, in South America, in parts of Asia. And I don't need to spell this out. You can just look at it briefly, but the gaps are quite large. The 175 high and very high income metros produce 15 trillion in economic output, 60% of the global total. When we go to the middle income metros, and remember, we're starting at a base of about $1,000 per head in economic output, 900 million people, 400 metros, 13% of the global total. Here we have the low income metros, which should concern every single one of us. 100 of them, it's actually less than 0.5% of total world economic output. We can just skip that. But there's hope. There really is hope. And this was surprising to me. What my colleagues were able to do was build a very nice little statistic. First time it's ever been done. And I'd like to see other people do this work, and I'd like to see us have a national and a global conversation. If we believe that cities power economic progress and we believe that they add to productivity, we simply did a rudimentary exercise. We compared metropolitan productivity, economic output per head, to national economic output per head. In the United States, a uber-productive metro area, the Silicon Valley, does not have a ratio of 2. It's about 1.85. In Europe, you can count on one hand, and they're relatively small places, the metropolitan areas that have a productivity ratio 2 to 1. Our ratios go from less than 1, which would be red, going up to 1 to more than 10. What you find, and it gives us great reason for hope, and great reason to believe that cities can be a fulcrum to development, is that the highest productivity ratios, the cities where its economic generation is functioning at a level exceeding its country, comes in the poorest and areas most in need of development. I just want to pose with a challenge, and I'll be talking about this a lot more in days and weeks to come with government officials, philanthropic foundations. Mayor Daley and I are going to have a great session, if you're interested, tomorrow. We're going to talk about advice to the megacity with mayors, and hopefully doing more with Walter and the Aspen Institute and all of you on this question. We are going to invest trillions of dollars in city building over the coming decades as we move to a world of 7 billion. We don't have good estimates. Colleagues are working on it, but suffice to say, when we take the infrastructure rebuilding, the housing, the schools, the community building, the environmental retrofit, everything with smart cities, automated cities, we're talking hundreds of trillions of dollars in investments. And what you find is that in contrast to other fields, let's take the healthcare field. There's not only a robust research infrastructure, and I want all of you to think about this, and I want all of you to help us out. When you talk about healthcare, there's a robust research infrastructure that was funded by foundations and by the government, probably begun by the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations a century ago. But there was also built a robust clinical infrastructure with all sorts of professional training and development and a diffusion mechanism worldwide. When you talk about business, I am so fortunate to teach in a Rotman School of Management. In business, we have a robust research enterprise, but perhaps even more robust than our research enterprise in that area is the executive training and professional development. The same goes for the law. Of course, in engineering, it's even more robust. There's protocols, there's tools, there's curricula. What's there to support the stewards of our new urban economy worldwide? What's there to support the mayors and their staffs. Think about your mayor. Think about, well, I shudder to think about my mayor in Toronto, but that's another question entirely. No, think about it. Now, you have some good ones. Denver had a great one. He's now been promoted to governor, and many cities have good ones, but they're schleppy mayors. And the research that's been done in Europe suggests that a bad mayor costs you a lot more than a good mayor. Now, if we're going to invest trillions of dollars in infrastructure building, if we believe, Ed Glazer, myself, Michael Porter, we can go down the list, Paul Romer, if we believe that cities are integral to economic growth alongside technological advance, scientific and engineering, and skill development, human capital accumulation, if we really believe this, are we content with the ecosystem and infrastructure for developing city officials, mayors, and their staffs worldwide? Ben Barber has a new book, my dear friend, coming out soon. I read it. I interviewed him on the Atlantic cities. He said we're going to have to create new institutions. It's a great title. I wish I had his title. It's not often I say that. If mayors ruled the world. What a nice title Ben has. And he said that in the coming years and coming decades, mayors, mayors of Shanghai, of London, of New York, of the Silicon Valley area, of Sao Paulo will become Moscow, increasingly important political and economic actors. He calls for not a League of Nations, but a League of Cities. Now, if we're going to talk in that way, our grand challenge of our time has to be how to begin to think constructively, how to build the infrastructure that can help us better build and manage more productive and sustainable global cities, and create the underlying enterprise, clinical approaches, tools and techniques that the people who lead and live in our cities and build them need to make our cities even better and power, hopefully, a new, cleaner, and more sustainable age of prosperity. Thank you all very much. Do we have any time for questions? Please, I can. Oh, do you? Oh, okay. And is there someone else with a microphone, or do you have the only other microphone? Okay, I'll let you guys identify the questioners from here.
So thinking about the unit of megacities, even the unit of discrete cities, you automatically start to think about, well, if mayors ruled the world, our political constructs don't always map onto the world of megacities. And what I wonder is, living in LA, I see the challenges that poses for, transportation planning, for example. You could say the same thing about New York City. At the same time, I wonder if there's this Jane Jacobs sense in which you have diversity of communities where, the fact that some people can live in Connecticut and commute into New York City and have their own little world in Connecticut where they get to make decisions like people in Connecticut like to make. Does that make New York City stronger? So I guess my question is, does diversity of political entities make a city stronger or weaker?
Yes, I think so. And I think we've thought about combining functions and creating mega governments. The word Mike Batty uses for this, a brilliant economic geographer, is he says cities are fractal. And cities scale. So city scale from the neighborhood to the community, to the city itself, to the metropolitan area, to the mega region. We need to be able to think of cities scaling that way, and most importantly, we need to give the people who lead cities, who don't necessarily think the way you or I do, or some do, many don't, have the ability to think about those various scales and what is appropriate at each scale. Joe?
My name is Joe Rodman, and we're very proud to have Richard in Toronto with his wife Rana, so he's one of our great stars, and obviously he's here, and you've seen the work that he's doing. Richard, one of the things that you've talked about that was not brought into this was the migration from the developing world or the up-and-coming countries like China, India, the BRIC countries, into the Silicon Valleys, into the Bostons, creating these multicultural communities. And the evolution of the creation of cities like Toronto, okay, which is based on a multicultural blend, as compared to the cities in the countries where these people come from? And what is the interaction? Because one of the big debates that's happening in Canada right now is a lot of the people from China who came to Canada are now going back. So how does that fit into the dynamic of the development of these cities?
So in my other work, and in Rise of the Creative Class Revisited, I argued very strongly that openness is the key, a key, not the key, along with 3 T's: technology, talent, and tolerance, openness and tolerance. Openness is a key advantage in economic growth and development. And in fact, the United States, to some degree the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and several other countries are very advantaged by that, because since talented people come in both genders, all sexual orientations, I mean, this is just all ethnicities, all nationalities, if you can draw in the most of them, if they want to come live in your neck of the woods, you get an economic edge. And of course, the work of Vivek Wadhwa and Annalise Saxenian and others has found quite powerfully that when we look at the Silicon Valley, anywhere from 25% to a third to 50% of those high-tech great companies, Yahoo, Google, we can go down the list, founded by a foreign-born person. So yes, the ability to be open and to attract talented people from around the world. And then the second part of your question, Annalise Saxenian answered for us, where she said we should never think about brain drains in a modern advanced economy. What a brilliant, we should think about brain circulation. And so there's very good new research on this, that in fact the movement of people benefits both the sending and receiving country, because we know they send back skill as well as remittances. So this circulation of talent in the world economy is a good thing. I actually believe that mobility should be a basic human right, but that's a topic for another conversation. I think you have the microphone. I can hear you.
I'm Richard Straub. I'm president of the European People Drug Health Society. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. I think it gave a lot of insight. As somebody coming from Vienna, I have some historical perspective on this, because Vienna, at the turn of the century, was one of the most innovative cities in the world. And the places where innovation happened was the coffee house and the salon. So these are things I think always to take into account, especially when we believe, or we may believe, that IT solutions will be the solutions for the city of the future. I think they are important because the complexity of the large cities are enormous, but I think we need to, as you I think indicated, we need to focus on the human element. And one of the suggestions I would have is to see, can we better combine the research in the field of innovation, there are open innovation, living labs, what have you, with the research in the field of cities.
Yes,
Thank you.
and first of all, thank you for your question. When I give my standard talk about the creative class, I say there are 2 people who influence me. I'll add one now. The one that I don't talk about a lot is Marx. Not Marx's theory of socialism, but Marx's theory of how society evolved. And then the 2 who really influenced me in the more modern era, I mentioned Jane Jacobs and Peter Drucker. I've never met Peter, but if I thought about someone who was a mentor and a role model to me as an intellectual and as a public intellectual, it was Peter Drucker. And my work is an attempt, however it comes out, is an ongoing attempt to merge the idea of modern management, investing in workers, investing in skill. I learned that from studying, it's interesting, studying factories. I was studying what factories were most productive. They were the ones that empowered the workers and gave them the tools to make decisions. So absolutely yes. And I think, I recently wrote a piece on Berlin because some gentleman, an urban economist, criticized me. He said, my theory was invalidated because Berlin has not become the high-tech center of the universe. I pointed out, drawing on other scholars' work, that Berlin had kind of a unique modern political history that he was perhaps unaware of, that its process of development perhaps was disrupted. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but perhaps it was disrupted, and that, in fact, Berlin now was beginning to leverage many of the things. And similarly, you could make the argument in Vienna. You see it happening to some degree in London. Now it was beginning to recover and even beginning to develop a little bit of this technology base. So I think we are seeing a shift to an urban tech. I call it urban tech in short. Not to say take anything away from the more suburban model that's quite robust in Silicon Valley, but there's a new model emerging, which is which is a new version of coffee house, gathering, talking, interacting, mixing and mingling, combining and recombining. And I think that's where bridging those two fields is an important area of research. I'm just going to ask these lovely young women to point me in the direction of who has the microphone. Thank you.
As a Chicagoan and as a high school teacher, I found this really an inspiring and fascinating talk, and I want to thank you for that. Your research seems to indicate that the nation state as we now know it is going to be drastically reformulated in the coming decades, and I'm fine with that. And if that's so, then do you have a sense of how we're going to develop care for the places in between the spikes, the places that will be left out?
You ask a really powerful question, which is going to be the question we're asking in the new iteration of our institute. It's in an environment where where we're going to have to do more with less, in an environment where government has fewer resources, in most cases, not in every country, but in the advanced countries. How are we going to make those investments? And a question you ask, which we're going to start working on, is what would a new social compact for a stratified, creative, knowledge, class stratified society look like? I can tell you it will not look like the old one. The old social compact was a perfect compact for the industrial age. My dad had one job, well, one wife, one house for life. You know, the social compact fit him, and it fit urban areas in need. I think we're going to have to build a new social compact, and in this country, you can see the schism. I mean, just look at the map of the election. We saw it. You can see it in the London election. You can see it in the New York election. We saw it in the Toronto election. The same thing that's happening at a national level. The schisms are occurring at local levels. So I think the big challenge of our time, I say in my book on the creative class needs to grow up. That's what I say. And we need to, if we're the resourceful, if we're the benefiting, if we're the one, we're going to have to figure out a social compact. I believe the centerpiece of that has to be to invest in the creative talents of everyone in every place and give them the tools to develop. But that's a subject that we're beginning on and we're going to pick up on in the coming years.
I'm wondering if you can play devil's advocate to your very provocative theory, because you've made a very compelling argument. But when I think about the current debate we've had on healthcare, for example, all of the interconnections and density of Twitter feeds and Facebook led not to innovation and out-of-the-box thinking, but apparently to a kind of conformity that's turned out to be wrong. So is it possible that sometimes innovation doesn't come from concentration, it comes from actually being separate from the mass? And that's not a takeaway from the main thrust of your theory, but are there exceptions?
Well, clearly groupthink does occur. And clearly that's why some cities, you know, Mansur Olson, he was so important, and we need to remember his work when he talked about why regions rise and decline. And he said, you'll get a very innovative place. It could be Vienna at one time, or it could be Paris, it could be Athens, it could be Rome. He picked on Detroit. He said the place was incredibly innovative. My friend Steve Klepper, colleague at Carnegie Mellon, shows the level of startup companies that were in Detroit. This made Silicon Valley look small at the time, comparative time periods. All of a sudden, though, he argued that these places get locked in. The ways of thinking become conventional. The management rules become locked in. The conflicts become all sorts of problems. And the whole thing starts to uncycle. So I think what cities do is two things. One, they allow new ideas to combine and recombine within their borders. When they get locked in, something new pops up. And that's what I would suggest is the interesting case today. I don't have the answer on this, but it seems to me that we're in a new cycle. And the question is, which of the cities in the world will pop up and drive the next wave of development? I think the jury's out on that. I think one can argue that Silicon Valley and New York and London, we go down the list, have a lot of advantages, but these are the times when these great shifts occur. So it's a balancing between the both, and what a good city system, not a city, a good system of cities allows to happen is that one of those places will pop up in this Darwinian, heartfelt and hardfelt competition and begin to drive a new era of progress. Please.
I'm not sure this is working. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Lisa Phillips from the New Museum in New York. Thank you. You talked about mapping innovation, and I'm curious about who is doing that and what criteria they're using to identify innovation.
Oh, we live in a world of bad numbers. We do. And the data on innovation are not particularly great. There's our data. We use the statistics from the US Patent and Trademark Office, which we've become more confident in, which actually can tell you the location of inventor. And we compare that to the information from the World Patent and Trademark Office. There's a young man at Brookings named Jonathan Rothwell who's doing remarkable work documenting innovation around the world. But those statistics are very hard. And we consider our estimates to be crude. We would hope to be able to get better information, but I'll tell you, in the world we live in with census and StatTan cutbacks, it's very hard. So one would hope, like the way we were able to use satellite images to drive economic output, one would hope that you could use other social media, big data, to begin to look at more robust. What I would like to have is more robust levels of actual everyday innovation and the expression of everyday creativity. For the life of me, that data is unavailable. If it is available, it's available in very small samples. But at least what I believe is that data that has some error, as long as that data is systematic, is better than none. That's where, and that in order to advance our field, we have to stake our claim and encourage others. I would hope, though, with the infrastructure of researchers in the world, we can encourage people to do better work and collect better data. But this effort to collect data at a global level, at the subnational level, is still very much in its infancy. I don't know who has the microphone, so you should stand if you have the microphone, please.
My name is Fred Kent, and we run an organization called Project for Public Spaces. And we have worked in probably 3,000 communities around the world in 42 countries doing something called placemaking. And this is kind of a ground-up, bottoms-up approach to building places within communities. Like last week, we were in Los Altos in Toronto, working on College Square, College Park in Toronto, that area, which you probably know. But what we see, whether it's a small community or a large community, that there's enormous energy in the community that is very creative and powerful, that if allowed to emerge, can have a profound impact on any community anywhere. So that's an observation. But the question I want to ask is, we have been using words like place governance and place capital. And to me, these are maybe ways of redefining how government functions and how we think about places within communities and the power that those places can have and how the impact they can have. There's two centers of that. Adelaide, the CEO of Adelaide, is leading a transformation of government so that he is allowing the communities, wants the communities to, and respects the communities to be at a level where they can be partners rather than dictating outcomes. And the governor of Michigan is doing the same thing. So there's something going on here that we're just beginning to see more and more, and you may have some observations.
First of all, I applaud the work that Fred and his colleagues are doing on placemaking. If I'm coming at things from the 100,000-foot level from above and trying to aggregate and synthesize, I draw crucially on the work that is being, the critical work of building great places. And I think when it comes to placemaking, there's just a couple things I could say. I think we need, and you're working on the better measures, and we're all placemakers. In fact, many more of us in this world take our identity from the place and community we live in. We identify, we care about it, we want to improve it, we're passionate about it. That's why we built the Atlantic cities. That's why we built that media vertical with the Atlantic. But there are some things that are just self-evidently dumb, which we know, Fred and I know. Like the idea that you're going to save a place by using massive amounts of government money to lure a company in. Doesn't work. Companies take the money and run. Like you're going to take a massive amount of your public money and build up brand new sports stadium. Now, I love sports. I'm a sports addict. I'm fans of teams, but I don't think the taxpayer should subsidize them. Convention centers, or now the idea that if we put a casino, I'm going to write this piece, a casino in every city around the world, which they're being proposed in, from New York to Toronto to Miami to Barcelona to Madrid, every place you live, we're going to have a casino, and that's somehow magically going to regenerate. Yes, we need good infrastructure. We need to plan our roads. We need to plan our bridges. But we need those small, you said the place governance. That's such a beautiful term, that regular, everyday people matter. And so at the margin in making great places, the investments are small compared with so many of these big ticket, and I think that's a shift in our thinking. Making great places may be the sum of many small things and independent actors, and focusing on making that place great, rather than these big top-down industrial era renewal projects, which our friend Roberta Gratz says she's still asking somebody to find example of one that worked. Not find one that worked. So I think that that's the new nature of placemaking, and one of the things we could do is help the cities in the emerging economies understand that a little better. Is there another microphone?
John, yep.
Please. Oh, I see.
Am I next?
Sorry, Jonathan Halpern with Designing Sustainability. Sorry to get it going different directions.
I see.
It's really clear from the lighting, how you get from lighting and lit in areas to mega cities. For me, at least, it's less clear how you get to the next step of those as drivers of economic growth or maybe even surrogates for GDP. I'm particularly interested in how you do that related to natural resources, because places that are resource rich but population scarce on your map don't have lights, whether it's oil, coal mining, or the ecosystems of the Amazonian rainforest that are the lungs of the planet.
That's the great question, and you and I should talk. The fellow who's done that is Nordhaus. The Nordhaus work that was published in PNAS attempts to make this connection, and in our group, Jose Lobo is pushing us. I'm not an expert on this, but he is suggesting, they are suggesting, that you can use the same kind of energy mappings to get a better handle on natural resources, and then questions like energy efficiency and environmentalism broadly. But Nordhaus is the fellow who's done more of that. In my case, I am simply trying to look at the centers of economic development, but that issue is one we're going to pose. My own hypothesis, this is a silly hypothesis, but bear with me, is that in the knowledge-driven economy that Peter Drucker would say, what I would call a creative economy, we're moving away gradually from wasting assets. It's taking a long time. You know, the Industrial Revolution really took us off on a big detour. We got very wealthy doing it. On the one hand, we're learning slowly from your work and others that we have to conserve our natural assets. On the other hand, we're learning that we have to conserve our human assets and not waste them anymore. So the creative city to me and the clean city are flip sides of the same coin, and I'd be happy to talk more with you offline.
Am I on? Yes. Hi, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. My name is Eric Larson. I'm with Mercedes-Benz, but I'm not here. I'm not in the business of selling the cars. I'm with our R&D arm, cool. And our offices are in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. So I certainly agree with you. The world is spiky. But my job in the company is to study the future of mobility, and I'm talking out 5, 10, 15 years, not next quarter or anything like that. And so I study obviously these topics. Cities. You can't avoid that. Demographics, all that's very important. But if I put the lens of mobility on this, especially in the United States, we distinguish within these so-called megacities between the suburbs and the cities, or more precisely, people who can get around with cars and without cars. And we are, in addition to obviously wanting to sell luxury cars in the future, interested in other mobility solutions. We have this Car2Go project, which is expanding car sharing project around the United States. My question though for you, I guess there's the really broad question for all these global megacities is what's the transportation infrastructure that's going to move 20 million people around in a dense city in, say, China? But then specific to the United States is, do you have any ideas for suburban mobility? Yes. Because all of our research shows that there is no move back to public transportation on a large scale, and for most people it's not even possible to get around without a car. So I'd be just curious about the suburban mobility solutions, because that is almost never talked about by anybody in the field, about the suburbs and those evolving, because they are here to stay in one form or another. So,
well, I'll just make a plug for another panel, because this is not an area of my great expertise, but we are having a panel on Saturday with the Secretary LaHood and a number of others talking about smart transportation. I'll moderate that panel and be the provocative questioner and chime in, but they'll be laying out their views. But let me just speculate. I think we are going through, as you said, a mobility revolution. I think it's the change in epoch. I don't think this is epiphenomenal. I think every era when capitalism evolves, from an agrarian capitalism to a simple industrial capitalism powered by, and then railroad-based capitalism, we're entering a new era of capitalism. And in every case, our mobility changes. We get faster every time, which is really interesting. We get faster every time. And what's so curious now is we have this conundrum. On the one hand, we have young people, not just young people, but people like myself and my wife. We move to an area, we have cars. I love cars. I'm a child of the 60s, so who wouldn't? I love German cars in particular, but we don't drive them very much. They've become kind of in the sense you said luxury car, they've really become a luxury good. They're something that we ride very infrequently. I have a 7-year-old car with less than 20,000 miles on it. So it's not something we drive a whole lot, but it's there, and we like it, and we have fun with it, you know. But I think you're right about the suburbs. I think what's happening in the suburbs, we're seeing a bimodal thing. We're seeing some of the suburbs that are experiencing the greatest growth and the greatest real estate price appreciation. They're the older ones on the transit hubs. And those older ones on the transit hubs are doing very, and then we have to think about a mobility strategy that involves cars and trains in the mix. So I think when I parse that, there'll be some people commute, we call them the super commuter, who'll be using a plane occasionally to commute, maybe not every week, but every couple of weeks. There'll be some people who are using a car to commute, at least partly. There'll be lots more people using trains to commute. And then when a fellow reviewed one of my books in the FT, he said, Florida he can't be looking at the future because he's looking at the past. I think more people are going to walk. So we'll get a lot more people who are going to live closer to where they work or work in their own home, and the mobility will be a mix of those strategies. But I think building a good suburb is going to have to require a real thought about the level of dependence of the car, and less the car itself, but more the infrastructure, roads, safe streets, bike lanes, that can support that. But those are the big questions of urban planning that we need to dig into.
Hi, my name is this on? Yeah. My name is Doug Eco. I'm here with NPR, but I'm a theater artist. And I know that for theater artists and many artists, especially over the last 10, 20 years in America, there is a pattern of creating a place, of artists gathering in a neighborhood, revitalizing it, producing great creative work, building theaters, galleries, and then suddenly those artists find themselves priced out of the neighborhood they sort of created the value of. And I'm wondering if you think the current pattern of sort of artists moving further and further out in Brooklyn, for example, is a good one in the way that you advocate mobility is in many cases a positive force, or whether you think we have to find some solutions for artists to be able to stay living in the communities that they themselves help increase the rent on.
A couple things. One is I feel like I'm making plugs for panels. As part of building this track in the world of 7 billion and cities in a world of 7 billion, we built several panels. Another one on Saturday is going to be myself moderating, Rocco Landesman, the head of the National Endowments, Darren Walker from the Rockefeller Foundation, Dennis Scholl from the Knight Foundation, on this whole issue of arts and creative placemaking. You know, I asked Jane Jacobs this question, and I love giving her response because it just shows the brilliance of her mind. I asked her the same question, and she looked at me, and she said, you know, Richard, when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. And I thought about that for the longest time. When a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. And her point was that artists and creative people give a place a vibrancy that creates, and I'm using Fred's term, not as well as he would, but it creates a place capital. And Carol Coletta and others are trying to create vibrancy indicators. My colleagues at the MPI are working on this. How do you measure the vibrancy that is created by a community? And I think that, you know, I have so many people who sometimes argue with me. Does Florida really believe that artists are important to economic growth and development? Huh? We know that artists are important to economic growth and development. We know that because there are 3 occupations that add to metro product: business and management, science and technology, and arts, culture, entertainment, and media. They're the 3 that have the big positive deltas on them. And then, just as an aside, when they finally get me really furious, I cite a study that my friend Mike Fritsch did on Baroque opera houses in Germany. And what he found, looking at Baroque opera houses in Germany, is that the places that developed subsequently, even those Baroque places were built early on in development, they had the highest artistic and cultural quotient. So if anything, it's not that arts follows. You know, people believe that places develop arts as they get rich. The 2 go together. It's not a chicken and egg. Back to your question. I think that this pattern now is sophisticated real estate developers have figured this out. They've figured out, you know, I was on Colbert because of my Bohemian Gay Index. It landed me on the Colbert show, much to my chagrin and outright terror. But, you know, I'm talking about being terrified. I've never been so terrified, bullets running down my cheeks. But, you know, savvy real estate developers have figured this out and are following these kinds of neighborhoods. What I think Jane Jacobs said relates to the question right next to you. She said, as this happens, artists are bootstrapping people. Artists are bright people. They're going to move on to the next place that's exciting if they'll go to Brooklyn or Queens or Jersey City or hopefully someday Newark, where I was born. But this process will go on. But back to your main point. I think that in the creative age, we have to take seriously. I want to think about this more, but I think in a creative age, we have to think seriously about how artists can generate a little equity, how they can create equity, how we can develop strategies as community development to give them a little equity. What might be alternative ownership models for the equity they put in? How might we value that contribution? I think those are all the conversations that we could have and will have in the creative placemaking movement. But you're absolutely right. Right now, well, the same thing in science and technology. Sorry to go on about this, folks, but there are a lot of really smart scientists who create a lot of value. And then a really smart inventor comes along and commercializes. Not saying that the inventor's done a preponderance of the work and the entrepreneur's done a lot of work, but the scientists don't get any real value for that. So I think there's ways to begin to think to give artists and other creative people a little bit more value, a little bit more return for the value they create. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Oh, thank you. Thank you for holding your hand up.
Is the mic on? My name's John Kunzweiler, and I've worked in Silicon Valley for about 30 years. And I've seen two things. First of all, you see all the great companies that we talk about all the time, and all that stuff has happened, and it's real, and it continues to go on. But the flip side of that is we've also seen just a steady erosion of the infrastructure there. Yeah. Highway 101 is a complete parking lot, and it's falling apart. The bridges have taken, the replacement of the Bay Bridge has taken, over 20 years by the time it's completed. You can't hold a cell phone call on Interstate 280. You have to either have two services or just accept the fact every time you go over a hill, you lose a call. So, on one hand, we enjoy, this incredibly successful place, but the mechanisms that support it and sustain it and keep it going are way behind and, frankly, falling further behind. So how do you reconcile the great future you paint with the realities of political funding?
So a couple things. One, a lot of my friends who are urbanists, and I'm a kind of dyed-in-the-wool urbanist, look at a Silicon Valley or a Nashville that has become a similar kind of center for music as an aberration. And they say, well, how does this work in a suburban area where you have a car? Well, it works just fine. And as Jonah Lehrer wrote quite eloquently, Silicon Valley has replicated in its own way the interactions that are at Central, different way than happened in London or Paris. It's created a cityness to it. And I sometimes argue with colleagues who are economists who are very bright, who believe that simply the denser a place is. So if you pile more and more density, you get more and more interaction. I don't know. I have friends who are architects and urban designers. I go visit cities that are filled with skyscraper districts in Asia. They don't have a lot of interaction. Sometimes they look like a vertical suburb. So the key is the interactive part, right? The key is not just the density. Density's key, but there's got to be a range. Say from Silicon Valley to something a little bit more than Manhattan. I don't know what the range is actually, but it's got to be a pretty good range of density. But the key, in addition to the density, is the richness of the interactions, that combination and recombination machine. And that's when we get to the case of city building. It seems to me, again, I'm using rough figures, that when a metropolitan area hits about 3.5 million, everything starts to go to pot. Below 3.5 million, you can get around. 1 million, 1.5 million, you can drive your car. My friends who moved to Nashville say it's easy to get to meetings. It's not like having to do it in New York or LA. You can ride, you have a parking spot. Somewhere around 3.5 to 5 million, infrastructure that worked for the car started to shut down. So I think we've got to think now, not just as my colleagues in economics are, that we've got to add density. They're right. But we've got to fix the infrastructure at the same time. Imagine adding just density to Silicon Valley. Now, it would be a complete, total logjam. So the real task, and I'll just go back to the case of New York City circa 1900. In 1900, the city leaders in New York said, we got to build a city. What was New York's population in 1900? A couple, 3 million if you took all the boroughs? 5 million? I don't think it was 5 million. We got to build a city that's going to support 10 or imagine how insane these people were. 10 or maybe 20 million people in the future, and that's going to require not only a subway that works, that's going to require external rail links and a set of highways that work. So I think this is the situation we're facing today. And I don't believe that we can just automate it away with better sensors and better technology. And that's going to help us, but we're going to have to think a lot because these spikes are getting bigger. Not only are they getting bigger, adding density and adding population will add economic vibrancy. So you're absolutely right. And I think that's where the leadership of cities get it better than the leadership of states and the leadership of nations. Alice Rivlin from the Brookings Institution said something very interesting in a book she wrote 20 years ago. She said, when it comes to economic innovation and productivity policy, we should move that sequentially from the feds to the states to the local area, because the local area seems to know best and have the best hands on that. So, yeah, I think it's a big debate, but it's where we have to go. I saw you have it.
I'm Nokwanda Ramategu. I'm a South African. I come from the African Leadership Academy, and I'm a Bezos scholar here. So basically what's happening in Africa is that we have relatively a smaller number of urban areas than rural areas. So we find a lot of people from the rural areas moving into urban areas at an unbelievable rate, and tons of them are just flocking in. So what happens is that when you get to those urban areas, there are further social and economic problems that we experience, for example, crime, and that they further also lead to economic problems, and therefore reducing the economic development that's supposed to be happening in urban areas. So what we thought we could do is probably develop cities in rural areas to stop people from going to the urban areas. But at the same time, I don't know if it's feasible, because we have a low population in rural areas, and those people are actually low skilled. So what would you advise us to do in such a case?
Especially when you saw those, well, thank you for your question, especially when you saw those, even if they're crude, built off light data, those extraordinary productivity differences between the hinterland and the center. My hunch is this is all of our obligation, that making this process work is going to be the key to developing your part of the world. And I don't think we can forestall the migration. My hunch is the migration will happen as people want a better life. Just like my grandparents moved from southern Italy to Newark, New Jersey. They moved there for a better life. It was really, so people are moving from the countryside to the city in their country, and then oftentimes to other countries. That's why I believe mobility is a right, to find a better life. And I think one of the things we can do is we talk about the problems of Silicon Valley or New York or Vienna. Boy, oh boy, we have a lot of expertise. Imagine if we could organize that expertise into some simple, I'm just shocked this doesn't happen, to some simple tools and techniques. It can be online, for God's sake, that help this, mayors can't even travel anymore. If they go travel somewhere and try to learn something from a colleague, they're on a damn boondoggle, and they're spending the public fisc, and they can't go. We need some mechanism to diffuse what we know and to help the development process around the world. And I think instead of our traditional model of national assistance, we should at least be trying, especially since they're so important, they're attracting so many people. They are called into productivity increase, relatively speaking, even though they're beset with many, many problems. We should be thinking about how we can, through modest investments in tools, techniques, training, and curriculum, developing of a clinical program, if you will, clinical practice around this, and I'm not sure what that model will take. I'm not sure if we need something like a World Health Organization from cities. I'm not sure if we need something like a World Bank for cities. I'm not sure what that model will take, but I know it's time to think about it. If we believe that cities are so important to our growth and development, if we know that they're critical to economic expanse and progress, we need better mechanisms to create new knowledge, to standardize that new knowledge, to identify best practice, and to create more skill and understanding among the people who help lead and steward our cities. I think that's it. I want to thank each and every one of you for your time. If you have any further questions, just send me an email. Thank you.